All right, I'm doing it. Today,
Let's do it.
I have a review
Okay.
that is connected to that year that we met when you started sharing reviews with me, because it's when I first started listening to podcasts in the
Okay.
car. So I have a review today. It is a 2-star review
Okay.
from Apple Podcasts,
Mhm.
written by Frinkydink 1.
Wait, what?
Frinkydink 1.
Frinkydink 1. Wow. Okay.
And this is for the very viral, very successful, ginormous podcast, My Favorite Murder.
Oh, which is your favorite?
My favorite.
Your favorite.
Okay, so here, this is Frinkydink's 2-star review.
Okay.
of My Favorite Murder with Karen Kilgariff and Georgia Hardstark.
Okay.
The subject is Hear Me Out. Hear me out. Start a different podcast. I have felt somewhat conflicted about this podcast since I became a listener about 2 years ago. Overall, I think K and G are both great personalities for a podcast, and I enjoy hearing them chat about their lives, recommendations, etc. And both are pretty funny. What made me feel sometimes icky about listening to this podcast is that A, obsessing over true crime, murders, etc., is not healthy. Point blank. Thinking about, learning about, and talking about the horrors of crime and human suffering this much are not good for your mental health. B, I also agree with some points made by others that true crime is inherently exploitative, even if work is done to try to honor victims. C, I also think it's damaging for both listeners and hosts when it's stressed how dangerous the world can be, how we shouldn't trust people, etc. When in reality, crimes like those they typically cover, parentheses, women being murdered by a stranger, are very rare and have been decreasing for years. True crime is in and of itself a morally and ethically ambiguous area. It's clear that K and G do not feel motivated or as enthusiastic about this podcast anymore, maybe because of mental health, maybe because of ethical questions, and have been essentially phoning in it for months. My solution? Start a different podcast about something else entirely. Make it an advice podcast, a mental health podcast, parentheses with qualified trained guests, or anything else you are genuinely passionate about. Your work is clearly not being you joy anymore, and it seems to not be bringing joy to many longtime listeners now too. Close a long and wonderful chapter with MFM and start something new.
Wow. Okay.
All right, Chelsey, what is your thought to this?
Wow. Frinkydink 1. So here's a little bit of the rub. But I'm going to depend on you for this side of it.
Yes.
I haven't listened to My Favorite Murder because like I am kind of a scaredy cat and I don't like to listen to things like that. But that being said, I think because of that, I'm sort of a good audience for this review. Here's how I feel about it. It's unnecessary. Why are you going on this podcast where people are looking for this kind of entertainment and insinuating that their choice is somehow incorrect or that they need to question the choice that they're making? You're wasting time. You're wasting space. You don't belong here. If you don't want to listen, do not listen. There are many of other podcasts out there that you can listen to. You go ahead and listen to your mental health podcast. Don't tell other people in the comments what they should and should not be listening to. Also, don't psychoanalyze the hosts. based on zero information. So Frinkydink 1, you're rubbing me the wrong way. And I want this to be known that I'm saying this as someone who has never listened to this podcast, and no offense, because I know how much Trey loves it, probably won't, because it's not my cup of tea. This is unnecessary, is my opinion. What do you think?
I mean, I'm just like applauding you because like I know you've never listened, and I am a super fan of the show. I started listening in 2017. I believe they began in 2016 or late 2015. Like I definitely started when there was less than 50 episodes. And they're up to like, 250 or something at this point. I'm a member of their fan cult, they call it. I've been to a live show. I own multiple items of merchandise. And this very podcast is based off of the template of My Favorite Murder. So it inspired me to create something. But everything you're saying, literally as someone who has never once listened to the podcast, is exactly like why this review was so insane to me.
Yeah.
It's like speaking, like giving a graduation speech to people that aren't graduating.
Yeah, this isn't your audience, hon. Move on.
Now, I will say, I will say that Karen and Georgia are very vocal about mental health. So I understand Frinkydink bringing up mental health, but I think it's just very dangerous to try to label anyone's mental health because it's such a personal thing. Like to say that this,
I mean,
just
I guess
odd.
I don't know. I find it completely unnecessary. I'm trying to even wrap my head around like, maybe like could it have been helpful if Frinkydink was just sort of like, used to love you guys, like was a big fan, to be honest, like listening to this kind of podcasts really started to affect my mental health, so I won't be tuning in anymore, but like wish you guys the best of luck. I mean, maybe that's interesting if you're saying that they do in fact talk about mental health on the podcast, so that like if it were you and I and there was something like that, I would feel like, okay, cool, note taken, let's make sure we're having this be part of our discussion, right? So I'm not saying we don't have a right to have a response to a certain kind of podcast, because like I said, I'm picky about what I listen to for the same reason. But I just think, what are you doing? Like how?
Well, it's interesting to me because they self-proclaim that they have been listening for 2 years.
Yeah.
They were somewhat conflicted since they started listening. So, okay, so what is that about? But then I also I just personally disagree, and I do think that I'm trying to sort of not be just so angry because it's a different viewpoint here.
Sure.
Like I do want to be a review queen and like honor.
Yeah, of course.
But I do think that that Frinkydinks opinion, that it isn't good to tell people that the world is dangerous, makes no sense. I mean, even My Favorite Murder has had people reach out saying explicitly that because of the slogan, like "Stay sexy, don't get murdered." Yeah, it has literally, people have contacted the podcast to be like, I protected myself from a very dangerous situation.
I was hyper vigilant because
and their whole thing about toxic masculinity and their quote "fuck politeness." They sold like rape whistles that said "fuck politeness" on them. I have it on my keychain.
Right.
Like, it's a way to like protect yourself, because
so that is like intentionally a part of the messaging of the podcast.
Oh yeah, absolutely. They also say,
what do you think about the whole argument about them phoning it in? Since you've been like a long-term listener, do you feel like that there's any merit there?
You're going to get me in trouble. Well, currently at the time of recording this, we're reaching the end of a 2-month break. Karen and Georgia have never taken a hiatus.
Okay.
And we're like on the 5th year of the podcast. What I've noticed is that, podcasts are free.
Yeah.
And so many of the listeners of My Favorite Murder, you listen to people in your ears and they become friends. So much of the experience of listening to the show is sort of like hanging out with Karen and Georgia, and then they cover these stories. So there becomes this ownership, but you know, aside from joining the fan club, it's free. And so there is a lot of opinion about what they should be doing, what they should be creating that's free. And so there's been a lot of possible decline conversation and the quality of the podcast over the last couple of years.
Okay.
Which like, I don't know that I need to really weigh in on, but I think now that I am making a podcast with you, I understand there is a lot that's involved.
Right.
And, I think that it is good to create boundaries in life and to set yourself up for success. And so, I can't begin to speak for what their experience has been, but there's a lot of vocal conversation in the fandom about quality concerns. But I thought this review was interesting because it's basically like, I mean, the first sentence, hear me out, start a different podcast.
Right.
But Frinkydink gave them 2 stars. So
that's true. It wasn't 1 star, I guess.
But to me, I guess like if we're going through our general roster of like how we're assessing this kvetch, it's sort of like, is
it useful? Like,
is there value here?
I don't think so.
Well, it's just so seeping in like a one-sided opinion, which sure, that's like this Frinkydink's opinion, but it's just,
and also I just like, I don't know, there's just so much about this that I hate. I just want to touch on quickly what you were just talking about. Because like, yeah, it is free, and people are people, and people are like tired, and people have different energies at different times. And I think we should be more understanding of individuals. And I really don't like that Frinkydink 1 is telling them to start something new.
Yeah, that's so pompous, right?
It feels very like, who are you to tell someone when something is at a completion? Like, maybe they're about to take off into like a huge venture that's going to like take what they've started and bring it like 10 million times bigger and larger than what it is right now. Like, we don't know, like things transition and things change in a natural way. And I just think to assign something like that, like to try and say like, you should end this, it's just wrong.
I mean, it's funny that like they're at the last portion of the review is offering my solution. Make a advice podcast. And this like whole review was like, here's my unsolicited advice.
Here's my unsolicited advice. And you should make an advice. No, you Frinkydink 1, you should make an advice podcast. Cause I think that would make you happy, because you like making lists and people like to take advice in list form. So I think you should make a listicle advice podcast.
I mean, as far as like the spelling and grammar here,
bad.
There were many like misspellings here. Also, it's really upsetting to me that it's broken down into A, B, C, D, but the A is not capitalized. So it looks like a weird misspelling.
So everything like B, C, D, that's all capitalized, but A isn't?
Yeah.
That's annoying.
And there are random words that are incorrect. So like, it does seem that they didn't really do a huge spell check pass here. I understand that if you're typing this in Apple Podcasts, you might not get the red squiggle line.
Sure.
I mean, what do you think of the truthiness of this? Do you believe Frinkydink?
I believe that Frinkydink had like this sort of adverse reaction, but based on the information that Frinkydink is giving me, I believe that they were coming to this podcast in the beginning with a bit of trepidation. And so I don't think that they are a typical listener. So I believe them that like this was their experience and they're being authentically true to like their own experience. I do not believe that this would be the experience of most people who would be seeking this podcast out. Because at the end of the day, as we know, there are thousands and thousands and millions, I don't even know how many, but like a lot to choose from. So if you're choosing to be here, I don't think that that's going to be your experience.
And something I think that is going against what Frinkydink is stating is that they listened for 2 years. So
right.
So I don't understand.
So they kept you captivated for 2 years, and then you decided you wanted to move on. And instead of just moving on with grace, you move on and you leave a little
I mean, I guess like
vulgar, but
I guess I can take a little bit of my like I'm feeling a little defensive
sure.
on behalf of the show, but to sort of remove that, I hear that Frinkydinks' point is I enjoyed this hesitantly, and
Right.
I'm noticing a decline, and I have decided what the reason for the decline is. And so
Right.
therefore, don't even go on the road. Don't even go on the journey. And I just think that that's like an odd, it's like a very interesting way to live your life, to tell other people what to do. I understand reviews are to like share experience and knowledge, but something about this is a huge turnoff to me.
Yeah, I just think whenever we start getting into like defining things as morally and ethically right or wrong, you know, I think we enter into slippery territory. So,
and I think that like it's so amazing to me your first gut response to this is so right on, because it is, even as someone who's never listened, like if you're not interested in true crime, you're probably not going to seek this podcast out. Although I was not a huge true crime person.
And you did, but like if you didn't, like if you weren't a huge true crime person and you tried it out and you're like, oof, true crime is not for me, do you think you would write a review, or do you think you would just stop listening?
No, but you and I intimately know getting people to write a podcast review is an involved process. It isn't as straightforward as it should be. I don't know why, and that's so ridiculous. So, like, it really takes a lot of energy. Like, it takes more effort than tweeting.
Sure. Yeah, that's true.
I mean, do you have any other thoughts before we crown it? Like, would this be a deal breaker to you?
No.
I know.
No, it would not. All right. I think we can crown it.
Yeah, I think I can crown it too.
Okay. All right. Should I do this? Oh, so I'll do that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So Trey and I each have our own set of 1 to 5 crown cards. In an effort to be fair and not influenced by one another, we will simultaneously reveal our rating.
The queens are tabulating.
Is that the first time you've ever said that?
No, I've said it
You've
before.
said it before? Okay.
Yeah, in like old versions.
All right. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Total score.
Go, Trey.
1.
I gave it a half.
I almost did half as well. Why?
I learned from you. I learned from you that we could do half crown. I wasn't even thinking about, because I think it's irrelevant, because I don't care, because I agree with the sentiment, but I think it's the wrong forum.
Yeah.
And I just think it's wrong to pretend like you know people that you don't in such a, pretentious way, to be honest. That was why I gave it a half crown. How about you? Why'd you give it a crown?
I gave it 1 crown because I think that the hypothesis here is really interesting. And I think that perhaps it would be better as like a scientific study where you were doing scientific research to figure out if consuming really dark content has an impact on your mental health.
Right.
I don't think the right place. I don't think this hypothesis should be on a review on Apple Podcasts. And this is challenging for me because I'm so biased when it comes to my favorite murder. But I was confused why it's 2 when the review was like, don't even bother.
Yeah.
And then like, I just felt like I was being told something is true, which is like not true. You can't prove that it's true. So that rubs me the wrong way. And so for that reason, I gave it 1 crown because I can see that Frinkydink put some effort in here. Their like wheels have been turning. So I appreciate that. But I think Frinkydink needs to do some scientific exercises to sort of weigh if this hypothesis is true or not.
I think Frinkydink needs to find a different forum for his, theories.
I agree.
Yes. Okay, that was good. Good try. I like that.
Now I can't ever look forward to doing my favorite murder again.
What do you mean? Oh, because we've now got, well, it's Mazel Tov, and
There's
And
a
I think
season
that
for everything.
yes, there's a season for everything. And I think that we all understand your love for My
Yes.
Favorite Murder
All right.
and respect
so
it.
Thank you for going there with me. And I appreciate
Mhm.
your valuable contribution as someone who has never listened.
Of course.
All right. So that's the conclusion of my review. So let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll get into Chelsey's review.
Love it. BRB.
Woo! SSDGM.
Baby, it's